Okay, cool. So I think we can go ahead and start it. Um, Hi everybody. Welcome to the ARO seminar series. So today we're gonna have the second talk that's centered around the topic of auditory cortex and thalamus. And today we are delighted to have Dr. Lori Holt as our speaker. So my name is Tong Shan. I'm a member of ARO Education Committee, and it's my pleasure to be moderator for today's seminar. So before we start the talk today, if you have any question during the presentation, we'll generally ask you, please put them in the chat first so that we don't interrupt the speaker. And after the talk, we'll have a Q&A session, and then you are welcome to raise your hand or just unmute yourself and directly ask your question. And we really encourage early career researchers to ask questions. So if you are early career researchers, you can put a ECR in the chat to highlight who you are, and then we will prioritize the questions from early career researchers. So, and then because time is limited, so if there's any questions that are not addressed during the session, it will be answered by a speaker in the follow-up email. And this session will have a closed captioning and will be recorded, as you see, and made available for additional viewing online on our YouTube channel. And if you are having any technical difficulties, please email headquarters@aro.org for assistance. Okay, so a little bit background information about Dr. Lori Holt. So Dr. Lori Holt is a professor of psychology at the University of Texas at Austin. She earned a BS in psychology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 1995 and a PhD in cognitive psychology from the same institution in 1999. She joined the Faculty of Psychology at Carnegie Mellon University as faculty in 1999, where she was an active member and ultimately co-director of the Center for Neural Basis of Cognition. She joined the faculty at UT Austin as professor of psychology and the Center for Perceptual System in fall 2023. Dr. Lori Holt is recipient of Cholland Research Award from the National Academy of Science and the James McKean Cattell Sabbatical Award, Fellow of Acoustical Society and Association for Psychological Science. Dr. Holt studied cognitive and neural basis of listening, especially as it's related to speech. She has been particularly interested in the role of learning and attention in shaping how we communicate and listen. And personally, I've been really enjoyed Dr. Ho's work, especially when her studies involves some really fun and clever way to investigate how people learn complex sounds by playing some video games. So that way we can study how people listen, perceive, and even how learn like different language and in sometimes in very unexpected ways. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Lori Holt, and she will be presenting her work titled Foraging for Regularities that Shape How We Listen.
Well, thank you so much, Tong, for the kind introduction. It's been a pleasure to have the opportunity to get to know you a bit as we put together this next session in the theme of auditory cortex and thalamus. And thanks also to ARO for hosting this series. Today, I thought I would showcase some of the roles of auditory cortex that it must be able to manage to support human communication. And on the topic of human communication, I've transported back to COVID times where I don't see any of you as the audience. So I'm going to ask Tong to field any clarification questions that might come up along the way. Before jumping in, I really want to acknowledge the collaborative nature of this work. And at the top are the faculty collaborators, Fred Dick, Adam Tierney, Fernando Llanos, and Taylor Abel. And down below, team lab members, past and present, who've played a role in the lines of work I'll discuss today. And you'll see some of these folks more on specific projects. And of course, this audience really appreciates the importance of federal funding that supported this work and really supported the early career of many of these trainees associated with it. Okay, so you know, as auditory scientists, that we love a good cocktail party, but maybe not for the usual reasons of the general population. So in the auditory world, the cocktail party has really become a canonical example of really how challenging auditory perception can be. So listening in on a good story from a friend requires mapping highly variable and ever-changing acoustic input in the context of overlapping acoustic signals with like multiple voices, music, the tinkling of glasses, noise from a fan, all jointly shaping the sound wave that reaches a listener's ear. So to listen in an environment like this really requires acts of source segregation, accommodation of noise and masking sounds, directed spatial attention, speech and speaker recognition, and many more processes, many of which have been extremely well studied. So today, I'm going to draw our focus toward another cognitive challenge of listening that's received somewhat less focus and focus separate from the kind of everyday naturalistic cocktail party. But yet I want to make the claim that it's very central to supporting our everyday listening. So to illustrate this, instead of a night out at a fun cocktail party, I want you to consider instead a night at home with a newborn baby. And so before infants speak, they communicate by crying. And there's actually subtle information in these cries, but it's available to us only if we know how to listen for it. So if we do an acoustic analysis, as the authors here listed at the side have done, it can be revealed that cries of pain during a vaccination tend to be louder and longer and more variable in pitch and to possess greater nonlinear acoustic characteristics compared to cries from the same infant experiencing discomfort at bath time. So what's really striking is that adults who have spent a little bit of time with infants and really haven't had serious caretaking duties of infants categorize these cries of pain and discomfort no better than chance. In contrast, parents and other infant caregivers who've spent a significant amount of time with infants are very accurate in categorizing these cries. Their accuracy, in fact, scales with how much infant experience they have, and their categorization ability generalizes to be able to categorize cries of unfamiliar infants. So this cry categorization really demands expertise that's built across experience to mold caregivers' ability to use imperfect and complex sensory input regularities to build new categories that can support behavior upon encountering novel cries with similar properties. All of this is part and parcel of category learning, and the latter ability, generalization, is a signature characteristic of effective category learning that lets us operate in variable environments. So I imagine that there's a pretty broad range of infant experience in the audience today. So I thought it would be fun to take a little test drawn specifically from this Corvin study. I can play you 4 cries, and you can just kind of keep track at home which signal pain, like a vaccination, and which might signal discomfort. Okay, I promise that's the end of that. I can't see your faces, but there's some discomfort from us listening to them alone, I think. If you're keeping track at home, the first two are cries of discomfort. The second two are cries of pain in vaccination. And the first and the third sounds are the same infant, whereas the second and the fourth are different infants. So I find this study by Corvin and colleagues to be so interesting because it highlights a very naturalistic way in which learning exerts its influence on auditory processing. But the influence is unlikely to be limited to just this example of infant cries, because discovering complex and difficult to describe acoustic dimensions that are diagnostic in categorizing sounds has been a central challenge for theories of speech perception as well. So today I want to draw our focus to some of the cognitive challenges of listening that are present, but are not yet fully understood. Sorry, I broke my promise. So where we want to go with this is to focus on the cognitive challenges of listening that require learning and draw online interactions with attention. So these cognitive challenges of listening are present in everyday listening. And though they're not well understood, I want to focus on two characteristics of them today. In the first part of the talk, I'll share work from an ongoing collaborative project in which we set out to understand the nature of cortical changes that happen when listeners become expert with a class of sounds, like baby cries or human speech. And then in the second segment of the talk, we'll pivot back to speech, where I'll share some data that make a case that learning is never really complete. It evolves continuously in listening, even among mature listeners expert in a domain. Okay, so what does expertise look like in auditory cortex? Humans and other animals develop remarkable behavioral specializations that allow them to identify, differentiate, and act on classes of sounds that are ecologically important. So this emergent expertise permits facial and vocal identification, object recognition, and at least in humans, speech comprehension. Now, these behavioral specializations are often associated with preferential and regionalized neural responses to a particular class of stimuli. This is really nicely illustrated from some recent work from Sam Norman-Hagnier's lab, where it demonstrates cortical selectivity with distinct components of response to speech, to song, and to music. So today I want to explore how these stimulus class specific responses might be related to the kind of learning required of new parents in learning infant cries. So one hypothesis for how this might happen takes inspiration from very early cognitive science theories. These theories are mostly oriented toward understanding vision, but they argue that learning drives endogenous attention to be directed toward perceptual dimensions that are most diagnostic to a task, like the most diagnostic cues for pain versus discomfort in an infant cry. This attentional gain hypothesis has been quite central in theories of both visual and speech categorization. But even so, there's surprisingly little direct support connecting category-specific modulation of neural activity with an underlying process of learning-driven attentional gain to diagnostic dimensions. So in a collaborative project with Fred Dick's lab at University College London, we created a complex novel soundscape in which to examine this hypothesis. So since no one has heard these novel sounds prior to our study, we have the opportunity to observe learning from the ground up in a way that's really virtually impossible for speech, since even newborns have had considerable prenatal speech exposure. So ultimately, this project, which is spearheaded by Chisholm Abasa, generated an acoustic space of around 36,000 complex sounds associated with 4 distinct auditory categories. So Chisholm finds that when we subsample this space in training with overt feedback, young adults learn these categories and generalize their learning to classify new sound exemplars that they've never heard before. So we constructed this novel soundscape in a very specific way that allows us to capitalize on frequency, the primary representational axis of auditory cortex, to selectively situate acoustic patterns that are diagnostic of category identity. So let me walk you through this. Each sound in this study is comprised of 3 400 millisecond chirps situated in a high frequency band, and 3 simultaneous chirps in a low frequency band. Here they're schematized as rectangles. So for 2 of the categories, we're going to situate the category diagnostic patterns of information in the low frequency band. And for the other 2, it's the high frequency band that lends the diagnostic information. But in each case, there's information in both low and high frequency bands at all times during the sound. It's where the diagnostic information that's situated that varies. So we populate each frequency band with 3 400 millisecond chirps, and those chirps are going to vary in frequency contour. These contours are going to follow one of 4 motifs that are illustrated with a single example in the top left and color-coded for ease in schematizing them. So to construct a stimulus, we choose 6 acoustically distinct chirps. And we choose them in a way to lend an underlying pattern that will signal category identity. Specifically, in the category diagnostic band, here illustrated in the high band, there will be 3 chirps that share an underlying regularity to define category membership. For example, here yellow indicates that the 3 distinct chirps following the contour motif of chirp 2, which roughly corresponds to a dip and then a rise, will populate the high frequency band. They're acoustically distinct, but they all follow the same motif. Simultaneous and temporally aligned chirps in the other non-diagnostic band, here the low frequency band, are acoustically variable, and they possess no coherent regularity or motif associated with category identity. And that's because they're randomly chosen among chirps 1 to 4. So in this example illustrated here, there's a consistent chirp 2 pattern in the high frequency band, and chirp 1, chirp 3, and chirp 2 all contribute to variability in the low frequency band. Another category, here category A, illustrated by red, is defined by a consistent chirp 1 contour motif in the high frequency band. So category learning between category A and B thus depends on discovering the diagnostic band between high and low frequencies in the context of simultaneous chirps in each, and then learning the pattern information, the chirp motif within it that differentiates category A from category B. So 2 additional categories in our space carry diagnostic information in the low frequency band in just the same manner. So okay, so if you're curious about how these sounds are constructed, that was just an example of category A, B, C, and D to give you a sense of this. They're difficult to tell apart, even having worked with these for quite a long time, but they're very learnable to subjects in a task. So you might ask why we go to all of this trouble to make such complicated stimuli. Well, situating the category diagnostic information, here the pattern or motif of the chirps, into a specific frequency band in the context of a simultaneous alternate frequency band allows us to capitalize on bilateral cortical tonotopic organization to localize cortical regions that would be expected to be relevant to processing the spectrally delimited category diagnostic information that signals category identity within a band. So we've aligned our category learning challenges with the representational axis of frequency and auditory cortex in order to be able to ask very detailed questions. So this presents a natural way to evaluate the attentional gain hypothesis. Every sound in our battery has acoustic energy in both low and high frequency bands. So if becoming expert in learning these categories leads there to be attentional gain for category diagnostic dimensions, then we expect increases in neural activation in regions that are tuned to these frequencies that we can identify with tonotopic mapping. So said another way, tonotopically mapped regions associated with the diagnostic frequency band should be expected to be more active than regions associated with the non-diagnostic frequency band in the context of categorization, if the attentional gain hypothesis is true. So Sahil Luthra, as a postdoc, took the lead in testing this prediction with a combined behavioral training and fMRI with major contributions from Raha Razin at the London Buckney Center. So prior to a single fMRI session, we had 49 adult human participants train on these categories for 5 days. And they trained to learn the alien identity that you saw in the previous slides, according to the 4 sound categories I just described. Participants practiced labeling the sounds according to alien identity in a 2-alternative forced choice task with feedback. And these blocks alternated with 4 alternative categorization across all categories with no feedback in order to test generalization of alien identity categorization across training. This was all complemented by an orthogonal task of alien size. This task involved all of the same alien identity category exemplars, but here, though, the categorization decision relied on stimulus amplitude instead of a pattern of chirps in the diagnostic frequency band. Participants simply labeled aliens as big if they had higher amplitude and small if they had lower amplitude. So as you can see in these behavioral data, the alien identity on the left and the alien size tasks were quite well matched in behavioral difficulty. Now, notice too that participants generalized alien identity category knowledge to novel sounds here in the middle. And these novel sounds were never experienced in the context of feedback. So at the culmination of all of this training, we're in a position to ask whether these expert listeners who are achieving greater than 75% accuracy on this novel categorization task exhibit evidence of greater activation in cortical regions associated with the diagnostic band that they're categorizing at that moment. So to answer this question, we characterize each participant's unique tonotopic organization on a voxel-wise basis across bilateral auditory responsive cortex. To map tonotopy, participants listened to concatenated series of 4 tone sequences that stepped periodically over 60 semitone range from about 175 hertz to 5200 hertz. One run ascending, one run descending. So the group data that I'm showing you here show tonotopy, but what they mask is individual participants' patterns of tonotopy differ in their fine-grained spectral selectivity. This is typical, and it leads us to adopt a region of interest approach to capture consistent regional differences in responses across participants. This also allows us to retain spectral sensitivity at a voxel-wise level. So here, each individual's auditory responsive cortices are parcellated into a small quilt of regions of interest defined across the cortical surface, as you see in orange. Now, for each ROI, region of interest, voxel by voxel, we examine activation during alien identity categorization in the scanner. This involves, of course, using the high versus low frequency category diagnostic bands. So we can then compute a high band minus low band difference in beta coefficients for each voxel. And this high-low contrast provides a measure of spectral selectivity within that alien category identity task. We can compute this same measure of frequency band selectivity in the tonotopy task as well. This, in the end, permits us to fit a regression model across all participants within each region of interest, with participant as a random factor, to create a kind of concordance map, as you see in the bottom right. These maps reveal the region of interest-wise concordance or alignment between voxel-wise spectral selectivity evoked in tonotopy, from bottom-up input, listening to tones that vary in frequency, and the hypothesized category-specific frequency band selective driven by kind of implicitly listening to the diagnostic band in the alien identity learning task. So in other words, we ask whether alien identity categorization that's guided by chirp patterns embedded in high versus low spectral bands yields greater activation in the corresponding spectrally selective cortical regions that we identify with tonotopy. So zeroing in on these regions of interest in both the left and the right hemispheres, divided here in the pictures on left and right, we can examine the concordance of frequency selectivity measured by tonotopy versus that which is drawn on line when a participant comes to the alien identity category decisions. Here, the hot colors indicate a positive correlation or high concordance. And what you see is that the activation in alien identity categorization is well aligned with cortical frequency selectivity to the diagnostic band. And this is despite the fact that each category exemplar stimulates both high and low bands in a bottom-up manner. So said another way, this pattern of results is showing that there's gain in cortical activation to the category diagnostic frequency band. And so swinging back to our original question, this lends support for the attentional gain hypothesis. But the results have more to say, because recall that the alien size categorization task does not rely at all on frequency. The decision, the task-related attended perceptual dimension, is stimulus amplitude. And so I've replotted the data I've just shown you for alien identity categorization, which is frequency dependent, on the left. Now showing on the right also the data plotted in the same manner for the alien identity categorization. And what you see is that even in the context of task demands that do not require overt reliance on frequency diagnostic bands, auditory cortex is still exhibiting these implicit category selective attentional gain. What you're seeing is that there's increased activation for the frequency band associated with alien category identity, even in a different task for which amplitude and not frequency is diagnostic of whether aliens are big and small. This task is independent of identity, yet still drives patterns of attentional gain to the diagnostic identity cues. So it's notable that this effect is observed even though scanning in this task took place an average of 9 days post-training. So this is consistent with stable changes in cortical activation elicited by sounds for which there's a prioritization of diagnostic dimensions that's going to persist even in tasks that don't demand overt reliance on them. Okay, but we could still ask whether this is really akin to other forms of attention that we speak of when we speak of attention in the auditory system. So as a further test of the attentional gain hypothesis, we compared auditory category-associated activation with cortical activation that's driven by explicit sustained attention directed intentionally at sine wave tones that are situated in those same high versus low frequency bands and are also simultaneously activating high and low bands in a bottom-up manner. So in this task, we give explicit instructions to participants to either listen high or listen low. And then their task is to report one-back repeats in 4-tone mini sequences in the attended band. We then ask whether patterns of prioritization of the frequency bands that arise implicitly in the context of alien identity categorization and indeed alien size categorization align with patterns of prioritization that are arising with explicit directed overt attention. And here, you'll see that the profile of activation for implicit prioritization of frequency band and categorization mirrors that of explicit attention to the dimension. So in other words, the regions that are recruited when listeners explicitly attend to a very delimited region of this frequency spectrum are correspondingly more active when categorization implicitly hinges on information situated within these bands. So in all, learning auditory categories results in prioritization of auditory category relevant perceptual information across a representational dimension. Here we've used frequency for its ease in mapping in auditory cortex, But you can imagine how this prioritization might be reflected in systematic changes in neural response to other dimensions of complex sounds. So this category selective difference in activation persists even when the dimension is irrelevant to the task at hand, and it aligns with patterns of activation that emerge with explicit sustained attention, overtly directed intentionally by the listener to the dimension, even for unrelated sounds. So altogether, this suggests that acquiring new auditory categories can drive the emergence of a kind of acquired attentional salience to the dimensions of acoustic input. So in results I won't have time to go into today, we see that this preferential activation for category relevant dimensions interacts with the degree of listeners' category expertise and also the rate of learning to acquire this expertise. Okay, so having become experts, listeners have not really reached the end state of learning. They've not reached some stable system of cortical processing for complex sounds that will, carry them through forever in perception. So to illustrate this, I'm next going to pivot to speech perception to make a case that there is continuous adjustment, continuous tuning of the relationships for how acoustic input maps to auditory categories. And this adjustment and tuning is done according to short-term input regularities that listeners experience. So if we think about the behavioral demands placed on auditory cortex, the need for this might become apparent. So in the context of this lecture, you are, at least I hope, extracting information from my voice that's relevant to understanding my message. But perhaps some of you might be listening from London, and maybe you had to make some initial shifts to accommodate the subtle acoustic differences of my American accented English. Now, having arrived at expert level coding of English input, we still often encounter communication challenges in which the diagnostic dimensions that signal a category can suddenly shift. So there's accumulating evidence that the mapping from speech acoustics to speech categories is not a fixed set of mappings, but rather a set of mappings that is extremely dynamic and adjusts rapidly. So next, I'm going to spend just a bit of time illustrating how profoundly these effects influence the mapping of speech acoustics to cortical representations. So here we'll focus on a simple example, the difference between beer and peer. Now here I've plotted it across two of the many acoustic dimensions that differentiate these sounds. And each dot in this plot represents an utterance defined by voice onset time, the duration between the release of the consonant and the onset of voicing for the vowel, and the fundamental frequency, or FO, of that voicing in the vowel. These two cues are major cues in signaling beer versus peer. And if we ask American English listeners to report what they hear across this acoustic space, reporting the category identity of each and every one of these dots in acoustic space, we see that both of these dimensions contribute to category identity. We can examine the beta weights across this space and using regression and to see that VOT better predicts category identity. This indicates that it's a stronger, more perceptually weighted acoustic dimension to these sounds. But nonetheless, FO also plays an important secondary role. Well, what we can do next is to present listeners with a subsampling of this acoustic space that obeys the canonical statistics of English. In English, shorter VOT is associated with lower F0, higher VOT, longer VOT with higher F0. Here, sampling that represents these statistics are shown with the green dots. So we can get a detailed look at how much listeners rely on the secondary FO dimension to signal category by holding VOT constant and perceptually ambiguous, and then varying FO. So these are shown with the FO differentiated test stimuli highlighted with the purple and the orange dot in this figure. When listeners categorize these two FO differentiated test stimuli in the context of a mixture of stimuli that involves this canonical English FO-VOT correlation, they readily rely on FO as an indicator, as a cue to category identity, which you can see at the bottom. Following the statistics of spoken English, higher FO is associated with more peer responses and lower FO with more beer responses. We can also stimulate an accent or simulate an accent in this context by reversing the FO-VOT correlation typical of English. You can see that here in the pink dots. And in this context, when listeners are categorizing the same exact test stimuli, now mixed into a simulated accent that reverses the FO-VOT regularity, you can see there's a dynamic influence on FO's ability to signal beer peer category identity. In fact, it no longer is a reliable cue to category identity. This influence is really rapid. It's evident for both overt category decisions as well as statistics accumulated across passive listening. And we've seen it across multiple speech contrasts, including consonants, vowels, and prosodic categories. So how the system weights incoming acoustic information seems to be dynamically adjusted according to the regularities experienced in short-term speech input, such as the kind of regularities conveyed by accented speech. So in collaboration with Charles Wu, Fernando Llanes, and Taylor Abel, we've used EEG to examine the cortical basis of these effects. The paradigm included active blocks in which participants heard stimuli sampled across the acoustic space and just simply responded beer or peer on every trial. These trials produced the behavioral data that I've just shown you. But what we did here is we interleaved these active blocks with passive listening blocks. In these blocks, participants watch a silent film while hearing only the two FO differentiated test stimuli presented in a 85 to 15 ratio, appropriate to eliciting a mismatch negativity response in an oddball paradigm. So the reason for this is that since active and passive blocks convey unique statistics, each is trying to measure a perceptual effect that's statistic dependent in the sense of tracking an accent in the active blocks versus eliciting a mismatch negativity response in the passive blocks. And so to accommodate this, we took the approach of interleaving very short 60 trial active and passive blocks, alternating 26 times within the canonical regularity and 26 times within the accent, counterbalanced across participants. So for each, the FO differentiated test stimuli serve as both standard and oddball for each subject, counterbalanced in presentation in those passive blocks. What this does, it allows us to ask whether the behavioral downweighting of F0 in the context of the accent carries over to influence how test stimuli are experienced in the passive blocks and how that impacts cortical processing. So indeed, the amplitude of the mismatch negativity is stronger, that is more negative, in the canonical speech condition compared to the accented speech condition. The top row shows event-related potentials for FO differentiated test stimuli as a function of when they were the standard, the frequent high probability stimulus, versus the oddball, the low probability stimulus. So as would be expected for two sounds differing by 80 hertz in FO, these potentials are different in the context of canonical English regularities. But notice that this difference is eliminated in the context of the accent. Now, these event-related potentials were being recorded to the very same sounds in both the pink and the green condition. All that varied was the interleaved regularities that participants experienced in between passive and active blocks. So you see these differences in the potentials plotted as the mismatch negativity response at the bottom. So in the canonical speech condition, the mismatch negativity response shows a negative deflection peaking roughly 150 to 250 milliseconds at frontocentral channels. And in the accented speech condition, this no difference from baseline was detectable. So remember that everything is exactly the same in the recordings across the green and pink panels, except that the short-term regularities in speech interleaved across the active blocks varied. So these short-term regularities experienced in the interleaved active blocks are leading to a reduced sensitivity to changes in F0 in passive exposure in the passive blocks. So looking at the active task, these differences are already apparent in the N1 potential 100 milliseconds after stimulus onset, and they have a substantial impact on the later P3 component that's often associated with higher order decision-making processes involved in post-phonemic categorization. So overall, this is preliminary evidence for a cascading influence in the change of how that simple acoustic cue of FO maps to speech categories as a function of shifts in short-term speech regularities introduced by the accent. So distinct cortical responses are elicited by the very same speech exemplars modulated by short-term regularities in the input. So this influence is substantial, neutralizing even the impact of an 80 hertz difference in FO. And it's taking place in rapid learning as the accent cascades, making rapid neural adjustments that operate at multiple levels of hierarchical processing. So this seems to suggest that there's no real line between auditory perception and auditory learning. Here in speech perception, the learning is really always on. So I won't have time today to discuss the learning mechanisms that might underlie the acquisition of expertise in the first half of the talk and the subsequent tuning of how input maps to these categories, as seen in the second half of the talk. But we have reason to believe they are distinct learning processes. In the latter case, here in the adjustments, the learning is driven by activation of existing category representations, and the influence is a weighted retuning of how input maps to the existing representations. It's not a wholesale shift in the representation itself. It's fast, it's reversible, and it solves the challenge of balancing how one might adjust to local regularities without a wholesale shift from representations that are really efficient in respecting longer-term norms. So, said another way, listening to me today has probably not overwritten the perceptual systems of London listeners, but it's created a short-term adjustment in the weighting of acoustic cues to speech representations. So to summarize briefly, we can see many of the demands of human auditory communication illustrated by the classic cocktail party. And at least among adult listeners, the kind of listeners who might frequent cocktail parties, it's been really common to think about auditory learning as something that's like really already been accomplished, with mature adult listeners in possession of stable mappings from acoustic input to speech categories and other important classes of sound. And that can be efficiently deployed to support behavior in these challenging listening contexts. And so in that way, it's easy to think about that as a stable support system for all the other complex demands introduced by naturalistic learning. But what I've shown you today is that listeners, even adult listeners, are constantly foraging the acoustic environment with a capacity to acquire new expertise that changes these mappings in a lasting way, such as parents acquiring infant cries or our listeners learning a novel new category. And this involves a type of attention distinct from the spatially directed attention that we typically consider in localizing voices at a cocktail party, to require that the system hone in on simultaneous information within a sound, a kind of dimension selective auditory attention. And so what I hope I've shown you today is that we can learn about how listeners learn the subtle cues of infant cries, and based on our results, speech sounds, that is likely to involve a prioritization of cortical representations of diagnostic auditory dimensions. The alignment of this cortical prioritization or gain with patterns of explicit sustained attention makes a case that learning and attention interact to create an acquired salience to dimensions of acoustic input that are best able to direct behavior. The interaction of learning and this sort of dimension-selective attention has been much, much less well studied than the spatially selective attention required at a cocktail party, but it's likely to play an important role in understanding auditory cortical processes available to support speech communication and that are deployed consistently online as we take in new short-term regularities across listening. So, and with that, I'll return to thank everyone again who's contributed to this work, and I'll turn it over to Tong, who can field questions. Thanks very much for your time today.
Thank you so much, Lori. That's a really great talk. Just a reminder to our audience, we welcome you to ask questions. You can put your question in either chat, or you can raise your hand or just come over and unmute yourself and just speak up. Yeah, I will ask questions while give people some time to think about it. So I really like the second part of the talk, that the canonical English and the accented English and how they drive the different response in brain. I'm just wondering, like, because English is not my first language. So I feel it's like do you think it's like when people hear like me that hear accented, like I have like Chinese accent, of course. If I hear Chinese accent, my behavioral response or like brain response can be different when like native English speaker hear this like accented speech.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so I think there's sort of two parts to that, right? That the representational structure that we bring to listening to anyone is influenced by our own long-term experience with language. And I think what we're showing, many other people have done beautiful work to show that, you know, when a listener encounters an accent with which they're unfamiliar, speech comprehension takes a bit of a hit. But with some exposure, the comprehension gets better. So there's some adaptation in the system. And what we're looking at here is a stylized version of an accent that allows us to make detailed manipulations of the regularities in order to try to understand the mechanisms that adaptation might occur. So like you say, it's very dependent upon the categories that one already possesses. So we can show, and not just the dictionary of categories, but the specific tuning of how acoustic cues map to those categories. So if you just consider just English listeners for a moment in the paradigm I showed, there are individual differences in how much an English listener relies on VOT versus F0. Overall, at a group level, VOT has a bit of an advantage. But what we see is that the learning in this task is driven the task is set up to be driven by having a very strong VOT cue, give you an idea of whether that was a B or a P. The FO cue then falls out of alignment with expectations and is downweighted. Among those listeners who have a less reliable prediction from VOT, meaning they don't use VOT as much, their downweighting is less strong. So that means that the system is using the input, whatever clear signals it has in the input, to access its category representations and perhaps make predictions. When those predictions are not met, the cues that are not aligned are downweighted. So we can see this even from top-down activation. So we can eliminate that VOT as a clear-cut bottom-up cue and instead use lexical knowledge. So we can have beef and peef with a ambiguous VOT, but because of the structure of English, beef is more likely. And so we can push the statistics away in a virtual, almost phantom sense. And that will also drive this kind of adjustment in learning. So we do, to answer your question, we do think it's really related to the representations that listeners bring to the task.
Great, thank you so much. I think I see Cajo raise your hand. Could you please unmute?
Yeah, thank you, Loli, for the amazing talk. It was really interesting.
Oh, thank you.
I have a question for the fast alien task. So I think you mentioned that the acquired salience and also the matched neural activity with the overt attention allocation to the sound. And I wondered whether if the attention is allocated to something else or the cognitive resource is like limited. The frequency salience, frequency selective attention activation of the brain disappears, or maybe these features pops out and attracts the attention in the bottom-up manner, even if the cognitive resource is limited.
That's a great question, Cajo. Thank you. So in a real sense, we haven't manipulated that in an experiment, but in a practical sense, we have, because these expert listeners who learn these alien identity categories learned outside of the scanner, and we did that intentionally to really only look at expert listeners. But of course, the brain activations that I was showing in all of those figures are driven in the context of the scanner, and therefore really, really considerable scanner noise. So I would, though we haven't looked at it systematically, I would hazard to say that these patterns of acquired salience in processing the alien identity category exemplars are persisting even in the context of noisy and adverse listening environments.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Cajo.
Oh, we have a question from chat from Antigua Muradova. Antigua, if you want, you can unmute yourself and speak up, but I will now read your question. So Antigua said, thank you for the webinar, Lori. My question would be, how does individual sound perception formulated throughout early childhood affect the likelihood of age-induced hearing loss? Is there a possible connection?
How could you say how it affects age-induced hearing loss? Could you read that last bit again? Sorry.
Yeah. So how does individual sound perception formulated throughout early childhood affect the likelihood of age-induced hearing loss?
Right. So I think, I would say that so two points is that, if we look at any given textbook on speech perception, it's easy to leave with the idea that the development of these speech categories is complete in infancy. And it's definitely beginning in infancy, and infants are beginning to tune their perceptual systems to the native language. But in the smaller literature of work that's really looked at child development of these categories, it extends way out into adolescence, where these fine-grained cues to category identity are being tuned. So to take one example from our own work, English children with no hearing loss, no speech or language deficits, are when they speak the raw and law sounds, or when they listen to the raw and law sounds, they use the primary, most diagnostic English cue, but they've not yet latched on to the secondary cue. And this is true even out into late childhood and early adolescence. So this to me suggests that there's like a really protracted timeline in which these categories are being tuned and updated, even though they're well underway very early. So I would think that depending on the onset of hearing loss, that would interact in interesting ways, right? So the more robust these representations have developed to be, where they can capitalize on multiple acoustic cues, perhaps the more robust the system would be to having some of those cues degraded by hearing loss, for example.
Okay, we have another question in chat. Jenna Bling asked, in the second study involving the accented speech, how do you think the learning would be different in a child population in comparison to adult English speakers? Following this, how do you think the learning is impacted in these children where multiple languages are learned, spoken as they grow up? This is from an
Thank
early
you.
researcher.
Yeah. All right, thanks for fielding that, Tong, and thanks, Jenna, for the question. Okay, to the first point of how would the learning be different in children? We haven't done much systematic testing of children in this paradigm, but I do know that young listeners exhibit these effects. And the reason for that is that we've been working with Taylor Abel's lab at University of Pittsburgh to look at epilepsy patients undergoing neurosurgery, during which time we can look at these same tasks in the context of intracranial recordings. Taylor is a pediatric neurosurgeon, and so some of the patients who've been through this protocol are quite young, and their behavioral patterns of downweighting of F0, like I showed you for our young adult listeners, is very similar. So my bets would be on child populations showing the same kind of tracking. So how would the learning be impacted if children had multiple languages? And that's a great question. I think there are some really interesting avenues for studying that, right? Because this effect, this rapid tuning is dependent upon the internal representations that a listener brings to the task. Multilingual listeners are going to bring interesting sets of overlapping representations. And it really, I think there's a way in which one could use tasks like these to really answer some of the fundamental questions in multilingualism about whether there are overlapping representations for phonetic inventories, whether they're separate, how acoustic cues are mapped to them. And so this could be a kind of a tool to understand better those underlying representations in multilingual speakers. But that's not something that we have looked at, or to my knowledge that others have looked at. Jessamine Schertz has done some really nice work with Korean listeners of listening to FOVOT patterns, where the Korean language uses this acoustic space differently than English. And interestingly, Korean is undergoing language change, where some listeners are weighting cues in one direction and other speakers weight it in another direction. And Jessamine is really able to show that the directionality of the effects that we showed today are really dependent upon the representations that those Korean listeners bring to the task. And so you can really see the kind of fine-grained differences emerge and in kind of predicting the nature and the change across here.
Cool. I think it's already 1 hour, so we probably need to wrap up. But thank you so much again, Laurie, for your great talk, and thank you, ARO, for organizing this seminar series. And just a reminder, our next seminar series gonna be from Dr. Ross Williamson on May 28th at the same time. So great. Thank you, everybody who's able to joining us today. And thank you, Laurie, again for your talk.
Thank you for hosting, Tong, and thank everyone for their attention. Appreciate it.
Great. Bye, everyone.